We'll probably take a chance if we can, because we need to cut grass.
We'll get started.
Good evening.
Good
Hey,
evening.
Jenny.
You thought I was gonna say good morning, didn't you? It's evening tonight. I am gonna ask you to grab a hymnal in front of you. Turn to 521. And we are gonna sing the first and last of On Jordan's Stormy Banks. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land, where my possessions lie. I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. When shall I reach that happy place and be forever blessed? When shall I see my Father's face and in His bosom rest? I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. Thank you all very much. Turn it over to my worst half.
Jonathan sent me a text and told me that he wanted to know if I could fill in for him tonight. And I asked him what he wanted, me to cover, and he told me what we were supposed to cover. And he said basically anything from Genesis to Revelations, and we're not going to do all of Genesis to Revelations tonight. But I would want to start with prayer requests this evening. Who has a prayer request this evening?
Remember Mark and Debbie? Mark has some serious kidney problems. And remember her.
Lauren's lost Tom Custer.
Tom Custer.
Yeah, and my friend Dave Breeden is in the hospital seriously ill. He took
Dave-
an ambulance last night.
What's that?
David Breeden.
Dave Breeden. Anybody else? Charlie Morris. Any update on him?
They did get him over to rehab, but, well, they can't, what I put together, they can't get him off the bench. He's really talking to his boy here a week or so ago. It was almost like, he was trapped in his body. I mean, that sounds stupid, but all he can do is roll his eyes. He can't raise his hands, he can't move his legs, he can't do nothing. He can't talk. Where he's been in there for, I guess, close to 60 days now. And he's been in that bed for the entire time.
Just remember Skip and Bev Hall, both had COVID. Bev's in ICU, but Skip's at home.
Skip and Bev Hall.
Yeah.
And you say Bev is in ICU. Any others this evening?
I have two.
Good, Danny.
Continue to pray for my mom. She's got arthritis in the back of her neck, it's giving her bad headaches and stuff. And the second one is continue to pray for the victims of that plane crash in San Diego, where it crashes in the house and stuff, killed the pilot and that other one, and then caught the house on fire, and went and sparked the UPS driver and killed him and stuff.
Thank you, Daniel. Any others?
Jeff, Haley Risher, Rock's wife, her grandfather just passed away, and the grandmother's not doing well, and then they also have COVID. Zeke, I guess they all know.
So far, what I heard about COVID, seems like it slowing down. It's not as much as what they think it would be and stuff. Here in West Virginia, they said more people get vaccinated, it won't be so much, but was not, it could top 4,000 people here in West Virginia.
Thank you, Daniel. Any unspoken this evening? Danny, you want to open us in prayer?
Precious Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for another day that you've given us. Thank you, Lord, for our church doors being open, Lord. Thank you for Jeff, Lord, taking this time out, Lord, to study and prepare, Lord, your word. Lord, we pray that you would help all of us, Lord, to be able to gain wisdom and knowledge from it, Lord, and we apply it in our own lives. Father, we pray, Lord, for all the prayer requests, Lord, that you may mention, Lord, you know each one. You know the urgency of them, Lord. Pray, Lord, especially for Cassie and Jonathan, Lord, with passing of their grandma. Lord, that I know it's probably a celebration for them, but Lord, they're all, you praise, give them traveling mercy, Lord, for them back home Friday. Help them, Lord, to enjoy the time in this certain situation, Lord, with their family, and bring them back home, Lord. Lord, we just ask now that you be with Jeff, Lord, and continue to strengthen him. Help him, Lord, as he brings you to him. In Jesus' name we pray.
Thank you, Dan. You got everything under control back there?
No, I don't think we've got the right microphone up. No, just tell me.
Channel 12.
Okay. I just can't hear you very well.
Well, I can speak up.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you'll turn Mon B up, slide the slider up to about +3.
That's better.
Mon B send on channel 12. Make sure it's all the way up.
Gotcha.
You're looking in the wrong place. Over here. There you go. Good? Is that better? Okay. Carrie Beth is doing my job tonight, so got to do a little remote control. I tried, Jonathan gave me Acts chapters 25 through 28. He basically had done, I think last Wednesday, chapters 16 through 20. So basically we've got chapters 21 through 24 that we haven't covered. So I'm going to back up and cover a little bit of background. Paul is in Caesarea, about to leave to head towards Jerusalem. Abagus is there with Paul. He takes Paul's belt and basically binds his own hands and feet and tells Paul not to go to Jerusalem, that he's basically going to be taken prisoner. He's going to be bound when he goes to Jerusalem. After hearing this, the people that are there with Paul plead him not to go to Jerusalem. And in chapter 21, verses 13 and 14, Paul basically says he's willing to face whatever may come. He's ready to go. He's supposed to go, and whatever happens in Jerusalem, he's ready for. So he does go to Jerusalem. Paul is arrested at the temple. The mob drags Paul from the temple, and they're trying to kill him. They close the gates. The news of all of the uproar that's taking place around Paul reaches the commander of the Roman troops there in Jerusalem. And the commander basically takes himself, some officers and soldiers to intervene in the situation. He doesn't know exactly what's going on, but he knows there's a big uproar going on. So he takes officers, soldiers, and they go down there to intervene. The crowd sees them coming. The crowd stops beating Paul. Paul talks to the commander. He asks to speak to the crowd. And when he speaks to the commander, he speaks to him in Greek. So that basically lets the commander know that Paul's not just, some uneducated individual. By speaking to him in Greek, he sees Paul as more of a cultured, educated individual. He speaks to the crowd. This is Paul. Paul speaks to the crowd. He tells them, how he was trained in the law, how he persecuted Christians. He goes into his experience on the road to Damascus. He's told to leave Jerusalem immediately, and that would be by God. He was sent to the Gentiles, and this infuriates the crowd. Let's see here. So the commander ordered Paul be flogged and questioned at that point. So he has the soldiers take him away, and they basically bind him or getting ready to flog him. And Paul says, can you legally beat a Roman citizen that hasn't been tried or convicted of anything? And so as soon as they hear that, they pump the brakes and say, whoa, wait a minute. This is a Roman citizen? So the rules for Roman citizens are different. In chapter 23, Paul speaks to the Sanhedrin. He basically says, I'm on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. Paul, gives more of a background for us. His, the fact that he observed the Jewish laws, persecuted Christians, and but basically said in a nutshell, the reason I'm here is because I stand on my hope of the resurrection of the dead. So basically, when he brings that up, you've got two different groups there. You've got Sadducees and Pharisees, and one group believes in resurrection and angels and things like that. The other group doesn't believe that at all. So as soon as he goes into that, it kind of creates a big uproar amongst the crowd there at the Sanhedrin. The commander ordered troops to take Paul from the Jews by force and take him to the barracks. In chapter 23, verse 11, the Lord tells Paul that he must also testify in Rome, just as he has in Jerusalem. In chapter 23, verses 12 through 14, the Jews come up with a plan. They want to kill Paul, not after a trial, but they want to intercept him and kill him on the road. And let's see here. And then also a little bit farther down in verses 16 through 22, Paul's nephew, in my Bible it says the son of Paul's sister, I think it is. So I paraphrased it as the nephew. Does that make sense? Everybody follow that? Okay. Paul's nephew overhears of the plot. He goes, he tells the commander, and the commander tells him not to tell anybody else, what he's told him. And the commander orders Paul transferred to Caesarea. And evidently he must have been expecting a lot of trouble, because he puts 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to escort Paul from there to Caesarea. In chapter 24, Paul is tried before Felix. Paul goes over his defense. He points out that the resurrection of the dead is the reason that he's on trial. That's really the sticking point that's causing the uproar. Felix orders Paul kept under guard, but with some freedom, so he's allowed to see some people and be tended to by his people. And Felix sends for Paul. And I'm going to read the commentary. We're not to 25 yet, but I'm going to read the commentary here for chapter 24, verses 25. It says, Paul talk with Felix became so personal that Felix grew frightened. Felix, like Herod Antipas, had taken another man's wife. Paul's words were interesting until they focused on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. It says, many people would be glad to discuss the gospel with you as long as it doesn't touch their lives too personally. When it does, some will resist or run. But this is what the gospel is all about, God's power to change lives. The gospel is not effective until it moves from principles and doctrine into a life-changing dynamic. When someone resists or runs from your witness, you have undoubtedly succeeded in making the gospel personal. And what happened there, I'll go ahead and pick that up real quick. It's 25 and 26 out of chapter 24, verses 25 and 26. It says, as Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. And then in verse 26, at the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. So basically, after that point, he sent for Paul on more than one occasion, hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, I guess to get Paul in trouble, basically. All right, so now that kind of brings us to 25. Everybody still awake for the most part? Okay. In 25, basically, the last part of 24, basically it says, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So basically, Felix had not found any fault with Paul. Basically, you've got Roman control, but few in number, and the majority of the people that are in the area are Jewish. And so to kind of keep the peace and stay in good standing with the people that he was ruling over, he basically left Paul in prison rather than releasing him and starting more problems. So he basically kind of just, left him in prison, kind of forgot about him and, didn't deal with him anymore. But now he's removed from power and called back to Rome. And then you have Festus come in, and it says in chapter 25 that Festus, 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. And they urgently requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held in Caesarea, and I am myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he has done anything wrong. So basically, Festus, being a just person, immediately after he gets in power, he goes and orders that Paul's trial, this is going to be dealt with. We're going to deal with this now, rather than just kicking it down the road. So basically, 3 days in office, he goes to Jerusalem. They are urging to have Paul brought to Jerusalem so they can kill him along the way. And so he stays in Jerusalem for about 8 to 10 days, and then he goes back to Caesarea. After he gets back, the very next day, he convenes court he brings Paul in front of him. So if you'll look at chapter 25, verses 7, and we're going to read 7 through 12. It says, when Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have done nothing wrong. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die, but if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So at this point, once he appeals to Caesar, it's pretty much done. He's got to go to Caesar and be dealt with in Rome. That's, they really can't do anything else at that point. So in verse 12 there it says, after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. Then a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice, they arrive at Caesarea. Festus kind of brings them up to speed on what's going on with Paul and all of the details. And Agrippa wants to hear from Paul. He wants to take a look at it. If you look in verse 18, it says, when his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. I was also at a loss how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. So basically that's Festus explaining to King Agrippa, the situation with Paul and why he's being held over to go to Caesar. So if you look at verse 23, it says that the next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus says, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man, the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing to deserve death, but because he has made appeals to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. And then he goes on to say that he doesn't have anything to tell the emperor about him. So basically, he would like to go ahead and listen to see what he has to say, so that Festus would have something to be able to write and send along as far as charges go to Caesar. Any questions so far? Okay.
It just amazes me of Paul, man that he was, when he was going after the Christians, kill them, put them back in prison. He thought he was doing exactly what he was told to do. Well, he thought that's what God wanted him to do. But here we've got a man now that is just the opposite. Now he's being persecuted for the same things that he was doing to the Christians when he thought he was trying to kill them.
Right.
It just, and he doesn't use any fancy words. He doesn't use a bunch of scripture. He says, hey, I'm going to tell you my story. And I think that's, you know, I think so many times we try to come up with, well, I got to have verse such and such, and I know and remember and all that. That's good. Don't get me wrong there. But when you tell someone what God's done for you, they ain't got no argument.
It's kind of hard to argue with a personal, first-hand experience.
Right.
To tell somebody that what they saw and heard and felt didn't happen.
Right. But, you know, it's amazing how God gave him, and he's getting ready to do it again, gave him the ability or the chance to tell his story to the higher ups.
Yeah, everything's kind of fallen into place, and people that probably wouldn't have given him the time of day or listened to him are getting to hear the gospel presented in front of them. Because he was traveling from place to place to place and was making his way back to Jerusalem. And in part of the story of his experience on the road to Damascus, at the very tail end of it, he, and this is back in, I think this is chapter 22, but basically, you know, he is told to leave Jerusalem immediately because they will not accept your testimony about me. And that was in second half of verse 17 in chapter 22. So Jerusalem was going to be a hard spot for him. Had he stayed in Jerusalem originally and not done what he was told to and left, he probably never would have had the opportunity to spread the gospel and get the early church up and running. That's basically, that's where Acts ends here at the end of chapter 28. Basically, it's about the beginnings of the early church. And but yeah, basically he had gone from being someone who persecuted them to someone that was basically explaining his experiences as a Christian instead of persecuting Christians. So now his fate, the people that are doing his old job are coming after him. Good point, Danny. Let's see here. So that brings us to chapter 26. So in verse 1, Agrippa gives Paul a chance to speak, and Paul compliments Agrippa. He tells his story, including the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and it says that the royal audience is spellbound. And Paul points out, that he had kept the Jewish laws, not in order for him to go to heaven, but out of respect for those laws. And he basically kept within the Jewish laws. And it goes over his background that you were talking about, where he had persecuted Christians. He explains that he used to persecute Christians. And then he details what happened on his way to Damascus in verses 12 and following. And so I'm going to start there in chapter 26, verse 12, and I'm going to read through 18. It says, "On one of those journeys I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priest. About noon, O king, I was on the road. I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads.' Then I asked, 'Who are you, Lord?' 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting,' the Lord replied. 'Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen of me and what I will show you. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So basically, that's the story of what happened to him on the way to Damascus. Let's see. And in the commentary here, I think it points out a couple things that are worth sharing. It says, Paul took every opportunity to remind his audience that the Gentiles have an equal share in God's inheritance. This inheritance is the promise and blessing of the covenant that God has made with Abraham. Paul's mission was to preach the good news to the Gentiles. So basically, he was told to leave Jerusalem, go preach to the Gentiles. And any thoughts? Down in verse 24, after Paul had presented all of the information he was going to present, it says in verse 24 there, it says, at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. You are out of your mind, Paul, he shouted. Your great learning is driving you insane. Paul says, I am not insane, most excellent Festus. Paul replied, what I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. So in verse 25, he basically kind of turns the table and says, hey, this didn't happen in a vacuum. This didn't happen, out of sight of everybody. And then when he asked King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Do you think that's almost a trick question for the king? Kind of basically it's kind of asking a question that you can't answer in a negative response to. Because if he's sitting there in front of all his people and he's asked that, well, do you not believe the prophets? If he says, no, I don't believe the prophets, well then what kind of light does that put him in? Make sense? No sense? Good sense? Let's see here. In that verse 24, when Festus jumped up, it says that Paul's message was offensive to the Jews and unbelievable to the Gentiles. So basically, it went against what the Jews believed, and then it was just something that the Gentiles couldn't grasp. It just wasn't believable to them. Let's look at chapter 26, verses 28 through 32. It says, then Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time that you can persuade me to be a Christian? Paul replied, short time or long, I pray that God, not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those sitting with them. They left the room, and while talking with one another, they said, this man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment. Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Basically, they find no fault in Paul. They said, well, all this noise and uproar and rioting or whatever you want to say that the Jews were doing at that point, that the Romans had to step in and intervene on, they said it's baseless. There is no reason, that this should be happening. This man hasn't done anything wrong. But the fact that he had appealed to Caesar meant that he had to go to Rome. He had to be addressed there. Which basically, to me, I look back and see that, let me see, where was it? Ooh, I got lucky. I found it really quick. It was in chapter 23, verse 11. And this was kind of outside of what I was supposed to be focusing on. But it says, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." So that was back when before the plot to kill Paul had happened. Paul was facing some issues, and but basically, the Lord says the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome." So basically, even if they had found him not guilty, if he hadn't appealed to be taken to Caesar to be dealt with, then they wouldn't have sent him to Rome. He would have, I guess, had to have gone on his own, because the Lord's already told him, you got to go testify in Rome. But so when I see this and the conclusion at the end of 26, it's just you can see the pieces coming together. I mean, Paul's in the midst of a storm and he's not out of it yet. These guys, Festus and King Agrippa, have decided that, there's nothing that he's done that's deserving of either death or being in prison. But you can see how God's plan is falling into place. He's gotten to defend himself, and by doing so, he's basically preaching the gospel. He's got to do it, in Jerusalem, in Caesarea, in front of both Festus and Agrippa. And now they're saying, hey, he's got to go in front of Caesar. So chapter 27 is where they get ready to take Paul from Caesarea and start him on his way towards Rome. So they basically handed him over to Julius, and I guess Julius was a centurion. So they give him to Julius. Julius is over him and also some other prisoners. They set sail for Rome. And at this day of time, when they get on a ship, it's not like today. They don't have GPSs. They don't have, the little things that they used to look through or whatever. It wasn't high tech. It's just not like they could go on, instrument flight rules and just read the instruments and navigate with everything shut off and completely in the dark, sonar and what have you. But it says in that day and time, basically had no compasses. They navigated at night by the stars. And overcast weather made sailing very dangerous and almost impossible. So at this point in time, the period of time that they're getting ready to take him to Rome is not the best time of year to be sailing. It says that they're doing it about the time of the fast, and that would put them Day of Atonement. That would be in October. September is kind of dicey. November is almost, it's not possible to be sailing. And here it is, October, and they're heading down the road, well, not the road, but following up the coast in a ship. But I actually took a picture of the map in my Bible, but basically they're starting out and they're basically running up the coast and around, and then they drop down and they're going to run the coast again before they have to make a large movement to Malta here and then go up to Italy. And everybody follow that on the map there? Got it? Okay. But they run into some issues, and sailing this time of year, no doubt, is a big part of it, just because of the time of the year it is and the weather that they run into. It's like hurricane season here. Well, it sounds like it's hurricane season there, but I'm stealing my thunder a little bit. Let's look at chapter 27. We're going to drop down to verses 9 through 12. Chapter 27, verses 9 and reading through 12. It says, "Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the fast." So it was already after October. So Paul warned them. It says, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. So basically, there were certain areas that they didn't want to be in the harbor and winter in. And they basically didn't listen to Paul. They decided, hey, we're going to go ahead and we're going to sail on and go ahead and start heading towards Rome. So let's see here. I lost my place just a little bit. Okay, so they set sail. Basically, they have a storm come up, a northeaster, and basically, anytime you got a storm coming out of the northeast and you're on the water, that's not a good thing. And so basically, they had hurricane force winds. The next day, they were still in the middle of the storm. They started throwing cargo overboard. It says they had no sun or stars for several days. And they finally gave up all hope of being saved. And that brings us down to about verse 21. So if you'll jump down to 21 with me. It says, after the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have been spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So basically, Paul tries to talk to them again. He warned them to begin with not to head out. They didn't listen to him. So he's telling them again that, God has talked to him, the God that he serves, and basically relayed that, they're going to lose the ship, but everybody's going to be able to make it okay. And then, let's see, we'll go to, so basically after that, they have a total of like 14 nights that they're in the middle of this hurricane, northeast storm. They're still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. It says that they, I guess this is the crew, felt that they were approaching land. So they took soundings. Does anybody here know what soundings are? I didn't. I had to look it up. Yeah. Yeah, they basically, it sounds to me like they had a stone on the end of a rope and they drop it down and they see how far down it goes. It's not like sonar. I was thinking soundings? A little high tech. But they basically, would drop it down and check the depth. The first time they checked it, it was 120 feet. The next time they checked it, it was 90 feet. So they're basically, we're going shallower, heading towards land. Let me see, I think it's chapter 27, verses 31. Let's see if I can find my place here and I'm right. I'm going to back up just a little bit. So I've already mentioned that the last time they checked it, it was 90 feet. It says, fearing, this is in verse 29, it says, fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In verse 30, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. So basically Paul saying, hey, we need to do what God has said for us to do for this to work out. So he told them, and the centurion and the soldiers believed him. Said, hey, we're cutting the ropes on the lifeboat. We're going to listen to him, basically. And so they had been on the sea. This is like the 14th night. In verse 33, it says, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And then it says, after he said that, he took some bread. He gave thanks to God in front of them all. And then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened up the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So basically, Paul is doing what God showed him, what he was supposed to do. The guards believed him. It'd been 14 days. Everybody was, scared, I would assume. If I was on the boat, after 14 days, I think I'd be seasick and probably just saying, well, when I drown because I'm not going to make it out of this. You just kind of just would give up hope. But so they eat. It tells us that there were 276 people on board. And then at daylight comes, they can see that there is some land there. They don't recognize what the land is. They don't know where they are. I would assume after 14 days with their sails up and just going wherever the ship goes, that you would have a hard time realizing where you should be. Because if you can't navigate by the stars, you don't know which way you're going, how long you've been, how far you've been moving each day. No way to track it. But they didn't recognize the land, and actually where they were, what they saw was Malta. They saw that there was land there and there was a sandy beach, so they decided that they were going to head to the land. I've skipped over about a half page of notes here. I'm getting it. I haven't missed it, but I'm just going from memory rather than reading through my notes. And so they basically get rid of the anchors. They cut the ship loose, try to run it to ground, and before they can get it to the beach, they hit a sandbar. The ship is just lodged on the sandbar. It's as far as it's going to go. The waves are coming back and hitting the stern of the boat, and the boat's breaking up. The soldiers basically tell the individuals that can swim to swim to shore, and then the ones that can't swim to grab parts, the boards or whatever of the ship as it's breaking up, and use those to get to shore. So one thing that I did miss is some of the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from escaping, and that's in verse 42. It says, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and keep them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could not swim to jump overboard and get to land, and then the rest were on the planks, and we've already mentioned that. Any questions about chapter 27? My wife has given me the time signal. I'm on the last chapter, honey. Yeah, we'll be out of here by 9 easy. Yeah. I was thinking 9:30, but 9, we'll make 9. Any questions up to that point? Nope. Everybody still awake?
I'm just thinking back there, 27. Anyway, in the King James Version, this is probably one of the saddest statements there. It says, then King Agrippa told Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Almost. Nah, I don't think I want to.
Almost.
Almost. It's almost like being in a revival, and I've seen people think, yeah, not this time, not this time.
And where did you see that at?
Chapter 26, verse 28.
Yeah, my study Bible is, what, let me see if I can see what version it is. It's NIV, so it reads a little bit different.
Yeah, you read it there. But anyway, it's stated in this, it's the same statement.
Yeah, the way that it reads in yours, I was going, well, I hope I didn't miss that.
No, you read it. But
Okay.
it's completely different,
Yeah, the way it reads.
the way it reads in King James.
Yeah, I've read it in the ESV and in the King James, not King James, the ESV and the NIV, because what I've got on the phone is the ESV. That was 26. Let me see what it says here. That's probably her back there twisting the lights.
It's not.
Why don't you twist that front dimmer switch just a hair? There we go.
It finally started working. The bulb's burning now.
Is it burning now?
Yeah.
See, Carrie Beth fixed it, Daniel.
Then I looked where Daniel was sitting, then that side started flashing like it had a short or something in them.
All right, well, we're going to not worry about the lights. We're going to get back to chapter 28 real quick here so Carrie Beth doesn't get me in trouble.
Okay.
28, let's look at verse 3, and I'll read verses 3 through 6. It says, let me give you just a little bit of background. They ran aground. It was actually Malta that they ran aground on. The islanders that were there were friendly. They realized that it was rainy and cold, so the islanders there built a fire. And then in verse 3, it says that Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself onto his hand. Doesn't sound good, does it? It says, when the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they each said to each other, this man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. But Paul shook off the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. So basically, they're trying to build a fire to get warm. Everybody's wet. It's raining. All these guys obviously had just come out of the ocean. And so they're trying to get warmed up with fire. Paul puts some kindling, or I don't know how big brushwood is. It sounds to me like it's smaller kind of wood. But he puts wood on the fire, and a viper attaches to his hand. And to me, a viper kind of gives you the impression that, you take a couple steps and that's pretty potent, is it not? A viper venom? I would think it would be. But so it doesn't bother Paul. The people at first see it happen and they think that, well, he must be somebody really bad and really deserve it because he survived the sea and now this snake's going to finish the job. Let's look down in verses 7 through 10. It says, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies that we needed. So basically, Paul, had not only survived the shipwreck, he survived the viper. That viper got people's attention, got him in front of the guy that was over the island, who just so happens to have a family member that's sick. Paul prays over him, lays hands on him, heals him, and it says that the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured in verse 9. So not only has he healed the father of the chief official on the island, but he healed a bunch of other sick people that had heard about what he had done for this guy's father. And do you think that would make people a little more interested in hearing what Paul had to say? Yeah, I would think so. Let's see here. In verse 28:11, so if that was back in October, so we're probably, that says they were at Malta for 3 months, so that's October, November, December, January. They're starting out in the first part of the year, in January or February at this point. In verse 11, it says, after 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered on the island. It was an Alexandrian ship. And then it says it has the figurehead of twin gods, and I don't know who these are, Castor and Pollux. And then it kind of recounts, where they stopped along the way to Rome. They went to Syracuse, they went to Rhegium, and to a place that starts with a P. I'm not going to try it. And then they finally end up in Rome. And it says when they got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. If you'll look down at verses 17, I'm going to read 17 through 22. It says that 3 days later he called together the leaders of the Jews. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, my brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me, but I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. But when the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, not that I had any charge to bring against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain. And then in verse 21, the Jews replied, we have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of the brothers who come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking about this sect. So they made arrangements to meet with Paul, and if you look down in verse 25, this is the last part of the chapter, it says, they disagreed among themselves and began to leave after Paul had made his final statement. The Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your forefathers when he said through Isaiah the prophet, go to this people and say, you will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their eyes, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. And then in verse 28, therefore I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen. And then it says, Paul stayed there for 2 years in his own rented house and welcomed all that came to see him. Boldly and without hindrance, he preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's the end of chapter 28. Any questions? I got a text from Jonathan a little bit ago. I had asked him if he had any updates for the church. It said, sorry that he just saw that. He said the funeral was good, all things considered. He says, we are most likely heading south tomorrow. We'll probably break up the trip for the kids. So that's the last thing that I heard from Jonathan. But any questions, comments? I turned the temperature down a little bit, but it seems like it's a little warm in here. Does anybody else think it's warm in here?
No, it's cold.
It's cold in here?
That's why we're awake.
That's why you're awake? Okay. I thought I was doing good. Hadn't put you to sleep yet. Night's not over that. But thank you all for coming. And any thoughts, comments?
Lee did a good job.
Thank you. I tried. I've studied for days. And I noticed about 3.5 hours today trying to whittle it down. And I got it as compact as I could that hopefully it would make some sense and we could make some points and look into it. But look on the bright side. By Sunday, Jonathan will be back and you'll have somebody that can really do a good job. So I tell you, it makes you appreciate the pastor you got though.
I tell you
Put
what,
that right.
Jonathan can get up here and start preaching. He just, he's fantastic.
Yeah, he is. He's good. And when you have to fill in for him like Kevin did on Sunday or like I did this evening, you really appreciate not only how talented he is, but how much work you have to put into it to be able to present it like he does. So makes me appreciate him a whole lot more once I had to do it. So. But thank you all for being here. Anybody want to volunteer to close us in prayer this evening? Gene?
Most and gracious Father, thank you tonight for this time we had here with Jeff. He's done a good job. We appreciate it, Father. Yes, we'll watch over our groceries as they take care of sleep safely home. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you.